When we built our first Hello World style application, we used a single command, the .NET command, along with an argument like we created .NET and then we typed in the word new, or we used .NET build, or we use .NET run, and so on. And you might be wondering, well, what are all the things that this .NET utility can do? So as we said at the outset, the .NET Core consists of several parts, including the Core CLR and Core FX, like we just looked at in the previous two videos. However, if we install the .NET Core SDK, it includes the command line interface tooling. So the tooling, as of the time as I'm recording this, is currently in preview mode, meaning that its functionality is likely to change based on customer feedback. Some find it difficult to understand how the Core CLR and the Core FX are in production, a 1.0 version. However, the tooling that we rely on to create Core FX and Core CLR applications are in a preview form. So a lot of this is the result of some last-minute decisions that were made with regards to how to simplify and unify the work of several disparate command line tools that were available while in beta. It's expected that in the November 2016 wave, there will be a more production quality version of the command line interface, or CLI, available with that .NET Core 1.1 wave, again, expected in November 2016, January 2017-ish. All right, so the CLI, command line interface, is described as a new foundational cross-platform tool chain for developing .NET Core applications. It's foundational in the sense that it can be scripted by integrated development environments, IDEs like Visual Studio, or build automation tools, or even using batch files. So it's also cross-platform, so that when you learn how to use the tooling on one platform, you can expect it to work the same way on all the other platforms. And we saw that whenever we were working with installing it on the Mac OS. I think I ran a few basic commands, like just to get the version and things like that, right? It would work the same as in the Windows console application as in the Mac terminal. All right. So there's a common pattern whenever using the command line interface tools. You witnessed it back in lesson 4 whenever we built our first Hello World application. There is the driver, which I've been calling a driver.net. And then you have some verb, and that some verb could be anything from like run, or it could be build, or whatever the case might be. And then optionally, there might be some command line arguments. And we haven't used any of these yet, but that's also an optional component of working with the command line interface. So you have the driver, which is always .NET. Then you have the command itself, or the verb, which could be run or build or new or something along those lines. And then additionally, you can add command line arguments. So I want to take a look at each of these in a tiny bit more depth. And we talked about some of these features in different contexts, but you'll see that it all kind of comes back around to the same thing. For example, .NET by itself, if you just were to run it, you're going to get the help. It's the same thing as just doing .NET -- help, and this will give you at least some of the verbs, or the common arguments, or rather commands, as well as a list of common arguments and things of that nature. Okay. So at any rate, the .NET by itself, the driver aspect of this is the first part of what you invoke. The driver really has two responsibilities. First of all, executing the intermediate language code and executing the verb itself. So what it does depends on whatever you type next after the driver. So if I were to do something like this, so let's go .NET / hello world / bin / debug / netcore app 1.0 / hello world .dll, then we would be able to execute our application. Notice that I didn't need to use .NET run, which essentially does the exact same thing, but .NET Run takes an additional step of looking to see if it needs to compile anything or skip the compilation. So, okay, there you go. In this first case, what we did right here, the .NET driver would execute the intermediate language immediately. But again, if you were to do this version, then the .NET driver would execute the verb run in this case, which does a few more things for you, like check to see if there's a compilation step required and a few other things as well. So that is the driver, .NET. But then you have the verb itself, which is the second portion of the command. And the verb is simply a command that performs a given action. So .NET build will build your code. .NET publish will publish your code. We'll talk about that more later. And then the third portion of the .NET command are the arguments that you would pass in. They're optional. You pass them on the command line to the verb command that's being currently invoked. So for example, whenever you type .NET publish, and then you can do the output, and you can say, I want to put this as my app. And so if we were to take a look, then here we can see that there's a new directory called my app. If we look inside of there are the actual DLLs and other configuration files that are intended for publishing. We'll talk about publishing in an upcoming lesson, but notice the most important part of that was the -- output argument that allows me to define then where I want to actually publish that to. So again, just to kind of recap this, you have the driver itself, .NET, you have the verb that you want to perform, in this case publish, and then third, optionally, you have the set of arguments that you want to pass in as well in order to adjust how the verb does its job. All right, so where do you find a listing of all of these verbs? Well, if you take a look at the help at this URL, you can find a list of all the commands and all of their arguments as well. So here we see .NET New, .NET Restore, Run, Build, Test. There's also Pack, Publish, Install Script, and then some other entries as well. You can ignore some of these. And as you can see, there's not that many just yet, but I'm willing to bet that this list will continue to grow over time. And I'd recommend that you would at least peruse this list so that you better understand what's going on, how it's working, what are the optional arguments for each of the commands that you can call. We're going to cover a few of these that you've not yet seen in some upcoming lessons, but several of these are, especially the some of the commands, or the verbs rather, and the arguments are for advanced scenarios that are really out of scope for this particular course, since we're just talking about the basics. And so the final thing that I want to talk about is actually listed here under extensibility. You can actually extend the .NET driver through a programmatic interface. And in fact, we'll look at this when we get into the Entity Framework Core course. That's what that team actually did, so that you could type in, if we had it installed, I don't think it'll work here, but let's just try it real quick here. .NET EF, yeah, we don't have it installed. But if you had the Entity Framework installed for this application, so in other words, I'm creating a reference to it in my project.json, we've restored those packages down, now we can use the tooling for EF, which uses .NET driver, EF, and then some other commands. So you can take a look here at this URL on screen, and you can see that there are a bunch of usages like .NET EF database, database drop, database update, DB context. So any of the tools that we would have been used to using Visual Studio on the what's essentially the PowerShell window that we're working with to create a new DB context, to update the entity data model, whatever the case might be, they're all kind of represented here as well as extensions to the .NET driver. All right. So at any rate, all you really need to know is that the basic shape or the usage of the .NET driver is to use .NET, then the command or the verb, and then additional arguments. Additional arguments have -- and then some value related to it after it, like we saw just a moment ago. There are a number of these arguments and commands that are available. Definitely refer to help for some information about those. And then you can also, if you want to extend the .NET driver to create your own behind-the-scenes functionality that will be kicked off whenever your users call.net. You can see the Entity Framework team use that in order to implement some of their automation features for the Entity Framework. And that's pretty much all that I have to say about this. Let's continue on the next lesson. Thanks.